Hey everybody, I want to talk a little bit today about what theology is and then also introduce the idea or the term epistemology and what do we really mean when we talk about epistemology. But first things first, let's try to briefly define theology and what theology is. We can look at this in a couple of ways, and I want to begin with the original Greek. Theology is really logos, words, thoughts about theos. Theos is God. Theo, the first four letters of theology, comes from the Greek word theos, which is really God. We can kind of jump down here if we need to. Whenever we talk about biology, well, biology is the study of life. Whenever we talk about zoology is the study of animals. Well, whenever we are talking about theology, we are really talking about the science or the study of God. In other words, for biology, life is the subject. Now, we are studying life. Well, in this discipline, in theology, we are studying God. Now, particularly in our class, we are going to be talking about Christian theology. We are going to be speaking about God in a uniquely Christian way. We are going to be talking about the Christian understanding of God. Now, we will be talking, there are other types of theology. There is Jewish theology. There is Islamic theology. There are several types of theology. But we need to remember that theology is about God. Okay, please be sure you understand that. Theology is really about God. Now, is psychology a part of theology? Well, perhaps. Again, dealing with the mind. Is anthropology, dealing with humanity and sociology, a part of theology? Well, perhaps. But I need to get this, allow us to understand this really quickly, that theology is about God. So, moving on, there are several types of theology. There are types, and these types of theology are specialized in the university, and I will unpack that just in a little bit. Well, there is biblical theology. There is the type of Christian theology that looks to the Bible and sees how the Bible talks about God in many different ways. Likewise, there is a discipline in theology called systematic theology. And what systematic theology tries to do is make sense of the many ways in which Christians talk about God. Tries to make it into a system, a systematic, coherent system of thought really about God. And then there's practical theology. How does one really live out theology? This is what we're probably most used to, especially if you go to a church of some sort. Likewise, there is moral theology. What can we think about ethics? What can we think about morality that stems from our view of God? If I really believe God to be all-loving, well, what does it mean for me to live a moral life reflecting an all-loving God? And then there's historical theology. Historical theology likes to look at history and how, in our circumstances here, the Christians and likewise the Jews have talked about God. Now, it's not just the people in the Bible, but it is also the theologians. A theologian is generally a university professor who does academic theology, much like a chemist does very, very academic work. Well, so too do theologians. They do very difficult academic work. Now, really quickly, I'm talking about the theology that embraces intellectualism. Now, some people, especially in America, have fairly anti-intellectual ideas when it comes to theology. Now, what we're talking about in this class, because we are a school, is intellectual theology. Theology that uses the mind, that deals with history, and that reads and appreciates those thinkers who have come before us. So here's the next thing that we need to talk about, and that is epistemology. Epistemology of theology. And epistemology is essentially trying to ask the question, how do we know? Okay, how do you know if you're hot or cold? Well, you can look at a thermometer, a thermostat, to see what it says the temperature might be in the room. You can look outside, or you can watch the news. You can look at your phone. You can find many ways to know what the weather is doing. Well, likewise, how do we know about God? This is going to be an essential question we're going to be asking, and I'm going to outline 4 ways that the church has said we know about God. In other words, what are the sources? What are the sources of this knowledge? How is it really that we know about God? And then finally, can and to what extent our sources be trusted? Okay, epistemology is the study of the theories of knowledge. How do we know? Okay. The first way that Christians know about God is through Scripture. Now, you'll remember from earlier on when we were talking about Alistair McIntyre that narratives, that stories are the foundation of any tradition. So, one of the main ways Christians know about God is through the meta-narrative, the overarching narrative that is provided in Scripture. Okay, this is a narrative which allows a community to interpret who God is, to interpret themselves in light of that God, and then also to make sense of the world. So Scripture is one of the sources of Christian knowledge about God. Scripture is a lens, perhaps. This comes from a great 20th century theologian who says that Scripture is a lens that alters how we see the world. If you wear glasses, or if you look out of a stained glass window, you can see that glass shapes how you see the world. And so Scripture, this long narrative written over maybe 1,100 years by several different authors, provides a lens, a new way of seeing the world. Likewise, we're going to be focusing on this quote in class. Literature is an interpretive presentation of human experience. This is why we, from the early evolution of humanity, have been narrative people, have been people of stories, people who like to tell these narratives over and over. So Scripture is the interpretive presentation of human experience. Now, what does this mean about theology? It's human experience of God. So really quickly, what is Scripture? Well, the Bible, Scripture, means ta biblia, comes from the Latin ta biblium, which means a library, the books. And so the Bible, or Scripture, includes a variety of literary genres. Okay, several literary genres are present in the Bible that offer wildly different views about God and about humanity and about the world. It was written about 1,100 years, spanning from, some say, 7, 8, 900 BCE, and then going through about 100 or so of the Common Era, give or take. It kind of depends on what scholars you read there. So who are the main characters of the Bible? Well, remember, theology is about God. And we could argue that God is perhaps one of the main characters of the Bible, of the collection of these books. Likewise, Israel, God's chosen people, especially in the Hebrew Bible. Israel, or in a broader sense, humanity, is also one of the main characters in the Bible. Turning to the New Testament, we have to deal with Jesus. Jesus is by far one of the main characters in Scripture. And then likewise again, and see how I'm dealing here with humanity, the early church, the early Christian movement is one of the main characters of the Bible. And so Scripture provides a narrative. It provides a story. And Scripture, again, is one of the main sources, if not the main source, that Christians know about God. Right? Another way in which Christians say they know about God is by tradition. Now, tradition comes from the Latin, which means to hand over, to hand down. So in an Episcopal school like ours, we believe, especially through chapel, that we are handing over to you, a student, the tradition of the church. And this handing over is seen in many ways within the Christian tradition. So it can mean, on the one hand, handing over, and on the other hand, it can also mean a body of teaching. So you could almost combine these two. We are handing over a body of teaching. Okay? Likewise, tradition also provides a narrative and a lens. So how do we know about God? Well, we can dive back into the tradition and see how the people who have come before us, how the tradition has talked about God, has experienced God, has understood God. These are the theologians. These are our ancestors who have gone before us. Okay? Tradition, however, continues to develop within the Christian community. Okay? There are theologians today that are allowing the tradition to develop, to change. If you've been following Pope Francis over the last year, the Catholic tradition has shifted a little bit in some of its ideas, in some of its practices. And so we can look to the tradition to understand how it understands God. So the tradition is another way in which we can gain knowledge of God. All right. The third is reason. All right. Most in the early tradition embraced reason. Most people in the early Christian tradition embraced reason. Earlier, I said that there are two different types of theology. There's intellectual theology, and then there's anti-intellectual theology. Well, maybe contrary to some popular opinion today, Christianity has always been a tradition that embraces intellectualism, that embraces reason. We can use our brains to understand who God is. Now, there are some in the early tradition that do ask, what is Athens? What does philosophy have to do with Jerusalem, with theology? Now, this is not to say that all people believe we should not use reason. On the other hand, we can use reason according to the Christian tradition to understand who God is. Can God be known through reason alone? Well, maybe not. Maybe this is one of the main ways in which we understand who God is. Right? And then finally, experience. Some scholars locate the beginning of the Christian movement with the experience of the risen Christ. Okay? Early Christians and many Jews had experiences that shaped their identity. Okay, let's look at the Exodus for the early Jews. That liberation out of slavery deeply shaped and impacted their understanding of God. The experiences of some of the followers of Jesus deeply shaped and impacted how they think about God. Whenever I ask students, what are the main things that shape your identity? Many of them go to this: experiences. Our experiences shape who we are. So many people say that personal or communal experience is the primary shaper of identity. And this is true if you were to think about this or ask your friends. How is it that you know certain things? Well, it's because you experienced life. So let's add this to the mix. So not only is Scripture one of the ways in which Christians know about God, not only is tradition one of the ways, not only is reason one of the ways, but perhaps also experience can be one of the ways in which Christians know about God. And so finally, how is it that we know? What is our epistemology? Well, for Christians, perhaps there are 4 ways in which we know. We know about God through Scripture. We know about God through tradition. We know about God through reason, through intellectualism. And then we also know about God through experience.